Welcome to In Deep, 2 hours of in-depth political conversation. I'm Angie Coiro. This hour, money and elections. Nearly $4 million undocumented dollars from the Koch brothers to elections around the country. The efforts to publicly fund elections. And Washington State's Darcy Burner on running for office before and after Citizens United against some very, very deep pockets. That's all coming up on In Deep. And it's time for our Blogger Spotlight. You know, it's not always that the person we talk to and the topic we talk about in our Blogger Spotlight is related to the hour. But in this case, it's all about that. We're talking all this hour about the influence of money on politics. And by golly, if a congressional budget isn't right in the news right now, we do record this show early for weekend broadcast, and we have just found out today that the Paul Ryan budget did pass in the House. Well, we already were lucky enough to have Dave Johnson scheduled to talk to us. Dave Johnson from the Campaign for America's Future. And Dave, you had been slated to talk to us about the Congressional Progressive Caucus's Budget for All. So now we can talk about what's in that and what the principles are behind that, regardless of what happens with the Ryan budget. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So it really does set up the dichotomy. It's a very clear division between the philosophies in the one budget versus the other.
I think so. I think if you look at the foundation document of why we have a country, where it says somewhere in there, I think it says "we the people."
Somewhere in there, yeah.
Yeah, somewhere. If we have a government and a system here that is supposed to be for we the people and a democracy, then you're going to do one thing. But if you really believe that these pesky citizens are in the way and keeping the few producers from making money, you're going to do something different. And we have here, you couldn't have a clear example of the differences between those two philosophies.
What are some of the standout differences?
Well, the standout differences are that the Budget for All from the Congressional Progressive Caucus invests in the people. First of all, it directly creates jobs through a number of programs. Second of all, it reinvests in what I call the operating system of the country. In other words, the government, the infrastructure, the things on which businesses then can plant themselves and thrive or not. That's what I call government. They invest in that infrastructure, in education, in those kind of things. The Republican budget, I don't like to call it the Ryan budget. I want Republicans to get the blame, not some guy.
Oh, you go, yeah.
Yeah. The Republican budget takes all of those things that we, the people, do for each other and just pulls way back on them, and then gives these just huge bonuses to oil companies, to basically the big financial powers that exist already, and then basically uses government to drive them to even greater riches. So it's a real clear choice. Are you going to do stuff for we the people and invest in we the people and our future, or are you going to just do stuff for people who are already rich and powerful right now, give them even more?
This is a theme that, we've already recorded some of the interviews that will be heard this hour on the topic of money and politics, and this is a division that's getting stronger and stronger, and it's starting to cross over party lines because we're seeing reflections in the Tea Party where they're disgusted with the money. We have Occupy Wall Street, who obviously is very aware of the problems that money creates, and rather than feeling like a non-mainstream fringy idea, this is something that is really starting to get some traction.
I think Occupy Wall Street did the world a favor by putting out that framing that everybody understands of the 1% versus the 99%. Because, man, you see it everywhere you look these days.
You do, and I'm hoping that translates to actual votes at the polls. One of my big fears is that, between the fact that everyone thinks Obama is strong enough to carry the election, and, for those who don't look at it that way, others will say, oh my gosh, well, the system is so corrupt, it doesn't matter that I vote anyway. I think the biggest issue for us is going to be taking that sentiment and translating it into actual votes.
Well, they have so much money, and they have learned how to use the money to really affect people with masses of ads. Look at how Romney, the Republicans don't like Romney, but look how he's sweeping things. He's just putting out these ads. He's outspending his opponents 10 to 1, 20 to 1, whatever it takes, and sweeping out with these ads that just lie. And, he'll say something different at the end of a sentence from what he said at the beginning of a sentence, and then he'll just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it with enough money that it swamps things. And I don't know. We're going to find out, because that's campaign, it's pretty clear we're going to see is big money propelling just whatever he has to say on the day he has to say it, and it doesn't even matter what he said yesterday.
We've got a little more than 60 seconds left, and I wonder if you can tell me, taking our focus right back to the progressive budget, what kind of reaction have you been seeing to that from people who have been willing to take a look at it and understand the principles underlying it?
Oh, people who see it love it. I put out a post the other day that says every progressive should know about this budget, and the comments at the different places it showed up, everybody's saying, oh, wow, how come I haven't heard about this? And, that's another issue of how come people don't ever hear in the mainstream media things like the progressive budget. Here's a caucus, the biggest caucus of the Democratic Party in the Congress, and you're hearing more about every fringe right-wing group that shows up with 8 people, and with funny-looking hats on. So people are so happy to see this. It does things like it raises taxes back to actually less than under Reagan to balance the budget. It does things like it cuts back on the war spending. It invests in our people and stuff. People are very happy to hear this, Angie.
Thank you, Dave, for coming back for us, and thanks for bringing more attention to it.
Thanks for having me on.
Dave Johnson is a fellow at Campaign for America's Future and a senior fellow at Renew California, and we're going to link to his pieces on our website, indeepradio.com. And as I said, we're talking this hour about the influence of money on elections. Of course, it's at an all-time high since the court decision Citizens United. But even so, even with the great amount of attention on that and the great amount of disillusionment built around it, it's difficult for the average voter to comprehend how deeply the money is involved, just how thoroughly it's involved. And in fact, just how difficult it is to get an assessment when not all of it is reported. And here's what caught my eye from Lee Fang. He was reporting at republicreport.org. We're going to put that link up on our website at indeepradio.com. At Republic Report, this is the very beginning of Lee's story, Republic Report has obtained financial audits showing that the billionaire Koch brothers, you knew they'd be in this, right? That the billionaire Koch brothers supported at least $3.9 million in unreported election-related activity in 2010. So we brought Lee on to talk about that. Lee, thanks for taking time out of your schedule.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So this is pretty amazing. First of all, the dollar figure is amazing. We're talking nearly $4 million. The second thing is the way this was done. These were huge tour buses that showed up from one place after another in support of a candidate where the election was contentious, and got volunteers and in fact even offered them Visa cards for their participation. I mean, before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, how does this escape being reported? Is what they have done here illegal, or is this, in this brave new world of Citizens United, this doesn't have to be reported? What's the deal here?
Everything that I've looked at so far, and I'm not an elections attorney, but it appears legal. Now, since the Citizens United decision, one of several decisions that have just incrementally unlocked this, vast ocean of corporate money in our election system, a lot of the traditional campaign finance laws have become fuzzy. So, these electioneering communications, kind of a esoteric term, but, these types of efforts, be they media or, get out the vote operations, the lines are now very ambiguous in terms of what has to be reported, what has to be disclosed, what has to be at least revealed to the public in some way. And in this case, this is the greatest example immediately after the Citizens United decision, where we see corporate interests. We mentioned Koch Industries, but there are several big wealthy donors that fund these types of organizations that really taking advantage of this Wild West of campaign finance laws that we now find ourselves in. So we don't know if it's illegal because the lines are so blurry, but it doesn't appear to be so, at least according to the experts I've spoken to.
Tell me how this works. So here comes this really beautiful, professionally made bus with the slogan, "November is coming," across it, and they move into town. What happens?
Well, the bus won't just show up in any random location. They tour the country, and you look at the map, it's just big zigzagging line throughout the United States. But what they're targeting are areas where there's a competitive election. In 2010, the House was up for grabs, and so they went to battleground districts across the state, where mostly where incumbent Democrats were fighting for their lives, so to speak. So the bus would roll in, be filled with Republican operatives who were recruited from previous campaigns. I mentioned one, Ben Marchi, who used to work for Tom DeLay, who was recruited for these bus tours in Virginia. And they would hold a rally, a Tea Party rally, host the Republican candidate, and denounce the Democratic incumbent. At the same time, they would sign up volunteers, offer financial incentives like $250 gift cards, as you mentioned, for their most active Republican volunteers, and plug people into those campaigns. The added benefit was, once you have a rally, that's what's called earned media. The local media comes and reports on it and says, oh, look, this Tea Party group threw a rally. And, they don't really see who's really driving it. It's not any random Tea Party rally. It's Republican operatives funded by a big corporate entity that's going in a very sophisticated way to manipulate the race.
Maybe I'm peculiar, but the part that appalls me the most is the gift cards to the volunteers, because I've worked any number of elections, sometimes for Democrats, sometimes for independents. You have people who are giving up their life's time, their life's energy, time with their families, and they're driven essentially by principle. And if they're lucky, they're going to get cookies and maybe some chips when they go there to make the phone calls or whatever it is that they do. And it appears to me from your reporting here that among one of the many gifts that Citizens United has given us is that they can buy volunteers now, too.
Well, sure. Another one of those groups, this is a different group I'm talking about now, the Karl Rove Network, the American Crossroads, they're giving out iPads and to their volunteers to go out and talk to voters and record that. In Florida, in just the last few months, at the Florida Republican primary, Americans for Prosperity went out and were paying folks, I believe, tens of thousands of dollars, Tea Party volunteers, quote-unquote volunteers, I should say, to go out and collect information about voters. So, traditionally, most of these campaigns have been done through the most passionate volunteers, the people who really believe in the candidate. Nowadays, it's there's that element's still there, but now there's lots of money to kind of grease the wheels, so to say.
Matt Fiddler, my engineer, and I were talking just before our conversation, and he had said that he thought if there's a commonality to be found between the most extreme Tea Partiers and the most extreme of an Occupy Wall Street person, you can put them in the same room and they will agree that the role of money is too much ingrained here in the elections. Do you see that as a possible building block where we can get people who see stories like yours, regardless of whether they're extreme left or extreme right, and work together against this?
I think so. I've seen some polls that show that Citizens United and the issue of special interests owning Washington poll very highly among self-identified Tea Partiers and occupiers. It's really the only issue they truly agree on. And, looking for expert advice on this, look at what the lobbyists are saying. A memo leaked last November to the American Banking Association, and there was a memo saying, we can demonize, it's from a lobbying firm, we can demonize the Occupy movement to help protect the banks. But if you look deep in that memo, here's the kicker. It said the real danger is, for the banks that is, the real danger for the banks is if the Occupy movement grows, they could merge with the Tea Party because they agree that the banks have too much power in Washington, and that's what the banks should be really scared about.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Well, let me ask about something else that appears on your site. And again, this is Lee Fang, who reports for republicreport.org. He's got one story after another talking about the role of money in the election cycle. And some of the most encouraging news that I've seen in a long time, Lee, is to see that a Republican politician is among a number of those who are saying we shouldn't have this revolving door anymore where you stop being a congressperson and immediately become a lobbyist. And again, this is emerging on both sides of the aisle. Yeah,
this Tea Party freshman, Scott Riggle from Virginia, from the Norfolk area, he got in there a pretty close election, kind of helped by some of these big money efforts. But, if you look at his rhetoric and look at his actions, he's actually becoming quite a maverick. He's saying, you know what, the big problem in Washington is that you have so many members of Congress that do special deals, they go through the revolving door, they retire, but then they go straight to K Street, and they use their inside knowledge, or they get payoffs because of what they did in Congress, and this is a corrupting influence. And he's calling for a lifetime ban on lawmakers becoming lobbyists. And this is a very interesting development because very few Republicans have actually called for this. And you can find a couple examples on the right. Another example would be Congressman Bill Posey, Florida Republican, not a Tea Partier, a Republican, but he was demonized from the left because he sponsored the birther bill. Do you remember that from 2 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is now he's backing up and saying, you know what, I'm looking at the anger at corruption in D.C., he actually sponsored a bill in Congress that places very strict limits on lawmakers becoming lobbyists. So there's a real movement on the right that I think the Chamber of Commerce and K Street, the big money people, they don't like this. But the movement conservatives are actually moving towards where I think many people on the left are these days on campaign finance.
You know, it's really funny because we're spending the other hour of our show this week talking about how the Republican primary candidates are trying to do outreach to constituencies that, in fact, they're working against. And in that particular hour, we're focusing on, the LGBT community, Hispanics, et cetera. But as I talk to you, it's emerging that the Republicans are having problems with the really sincere Tea Partiers as well, because they genuinely don't like this role of money in elections. How do you see the Republicans trying to smooth that out with them? Or are they just looking away?
I could give you maybe one anecdote that kind of, I think, dramatizes this tension you see on the right. There's a special deal on health reform that Obama cut with the pharmaceutical lobby to basically make sure that we're not negotiating for lower drug prices. It's a big multi-billion-dollar boon for their industry, right? And a lot of both people on the left and the right were angry about this. Now, I've heard from people in Washington, D.C., that Republicans were planning to make an issue of that this year because, that would excite the Tea Party base to, accuse Obama of crony capitalism for working with the drug companies. But the drug companies came in and used their lobbyists, and they told the Republicans to shut up and not make a big stink about this, and they did. So this is an issue they could have used to capitalize Tea Party anger at the Obama administration, but they basically took a knee. They said, you know what, who's more important, the Tea Party or these drug company lobbyists? And they chose the drug companies. So you see this tension all across both parties, really, but it's actually hamstringing the Republicans in their fight against Obama and health reform.
Lee, I'm going to come at you just from complete left field with this next question, but do you imagine that there is any possibility we will see publicly funded campaigns within our lifetime?
Well, if you look on the state level, there's some clean election laws, albeit they're very weak. But, Arizona, New Jersey, Maine, these states are leading the way when the federal government has failed. And, certainly not in the short term with a far-right Congress that's dominated by K Street interests will we see any movement. But listen, this corruption issue is growing and growing and growing. We saw the kind of kindles of it with the Occupy movement. I think after this whole 2012 election is said and done, and American voters are disgusted by all the ads and the money, next year I think we're going to see a new wave of scandals, because you can't have billions of dollars spent in the campaign and not have a scandal. And when those scandals break, we'll see a cycle of reform. Maybe that's idealistic, but if you look back in American history, you had the Gilded era with, massive dirty dealing. Literally, you had lobbyists coming in with bags of money, giving it to legislators to give them favors. And then you had the Progressive era, where you had the creation of the FDA and all these other regulatory bodies. Will we see another Watergate-like scandal and then a reform cycle? Maybe. I'm hopeful.
Lee, we're going to have you back on to talk about it if they do. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Angie, thank you so much. Nice talking to you.
Lee Fang, you will find a link to his work at Republic Report on our website at indeepradio.com. You're listening to In Deep. You're listening to In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. Thank you for tuning in. And as you've been hearing, our focus this hour is elections bought and sold. And in fact, pretty much the whole political process in America is now more subject to who's got the most money than it ever has been, especially in the wake of the Citizens United campaign. We now get the perspectives from a senior reporter and editor at AlterNet.org. Steve Rosenfeld is joining us on the line here. He covers democracy issues for AlterNet, and he's also covered many of the states that adopted public financing laws in the 1990s when he was working with Monitor Radio and NPR. The author of several books as well. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk about that sentiment. When the states were adopting public financing laws back in the 1990s, obviously that was before the Citizens United decision, but people were already aware that this was no way to run a country.
Yeah. What happened was, it seems like it's the quaint good old days compared to today. But it seems with every successive presidential election and more presidential cycles than the in-betweens, the midterms, more and more money comes in or finds different loopholes. And candidates themselves have to spend more time raising money from fewer people. And they don't like it either. And I was Bernie Sanders' press secretary when he got elected to the House, and he hated it. That was 1990. So the idea was, well, what can you do about it? And the basic premise behind public financing, because there was, the Supreme Court draws the legal landscape and you look for little legs to stand on. The basic premise was you're never going to catch up to the people who are raising the gazillions of dollars on the top, but maybe there's a way to sort of have a floor or an entry-level point where if you've got enough community support and enough money to sort of do some kind of, paid media, you stand some kind of a chance. So that's basically what was sort of motivating people. As it's not like it was to entirely balance, the flood of big money, but essentially try to create, an alternative way for candidates to get into the systems. So different states went about passing these laws, and we could talk about how they work. But that's the general idea, that it was supposed to create, like another way in. So for people who have support and have community backing, but don't have the big wallets.
One of the things that comes to mind as I hear you talking, here in California, of course, we saw the failed campaign of Meg Whitman. And Meg Whitman had tons of eBay money, an inexhaustible source of funds. And there was a lot of concern here, and in some cases not concern, but, perfectly happy with it, that she might, in fact, be in position to buy an election. And she didn't win. And one of the concerns I have from that is that may give people the signal that the issue of so much personal, private, and in some cases, unrevealed money may not be the big issue we're making it out to be.
Well, I think that you need to sort of break it down a little bit there, because here's what's really going on. It's true that self-finance candidates, for the most part, now whether this was Ross Perot, whether this was Steve Forbes, whether this is Meg Whitman, maybe these names are a little too old for some of your listeners, but these are other presidential candidates, not Meg Whitman, she was running for governor, that basically self-financed their campaigns and did not win. Now, usually they don't win. Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, is an exception. But, in politics there are always exceptions. But the thing is, there's different kinds of big money in politics. There's the self-finance candidate, the guy who ran for Senate against Barack Obama spent something like $25 million of his own money. He had a big hedge fund, and he lost. Oh. And the thing is, that's different from the big institutional money. And what do I mean by that? This is what you really see happening this election. In the Republican primaries, essentially you have political venture capitalists investing their private money, and they're disclosing it, by the way. The Sheldon Adelsons behind Newt Gingrich and other people behind Rick Santorum and Romney. So anyway, they're disclosing it, but they're it's basically one person's bet on a candidate. The money that is going to mostly be hidden this year is coming in through nonprofits, and nonprofits don't have to disclose it, and it's more institutional. It's basically perverting the use of nonprofits, turning from an organization that was created by the IRS for social purposes into basically political animals. So this is where Karl Rove is spending all his time, and and not to their credit, the Democrats are following suit, but they're not nearly doing as good a job as the Republicans, and that's always the case.
I was going to say, boy, there's a whole hour in itself, isn't it?
but the thing is, if you look at where the big money comes into, it's not with either candidates necessarily, the most pernicious money. It's not with candidates who are sort of reaching into their own pockets, or with sort of the political venture capitalists backing these guys early in the nominating process. It's when the institutional players come in. Now, and this is, these are lobbyists both right and left. They are invested in the status quo. They have the big PACs. And they also, because of Citizens United, if they're corporations, they're not going to take a risk at offending their customers by getting behind one, candidate that's too ideological. Instead, they'll go behind something where they don't have to reveal who they are, and they'll basically be pushing their side of the aisle, which tends to be Republican. Mm-hmm. So there's big money and there's big money, and it's a pretty important distinction, because a lot of people have been saying, "Oh, what's the big deal with the super PACs? Where's all the corporate money?" The corporate money is waiting. It's waiting till the conventions are over. It's being given to the nonprofits, and we won't even know about it.
Steve Rosenfeld is with AlterNet, where he's a senior reporter and editor. And Steve, in our last segment, we talked to Lee Fang, and one of the things that he brought up is that there's so much in flux with laws since Citizens United. It's not even clear now what the disclosure laws are. Some of this still has to work its way through the courts. And you were talking about the money that's been disclosed. Part of what he talked about, for anyone who missed that, they can hear it on our website, indeepradio.com. The Republic Report found that the Koch brothers put nearly $4 million in unreported election-related activity in 2010. They were bringing buses into town in contentious elections so that they could harangue about the Democrat while boosting the Republic. They were giving away Visa cards to volunteers, $250 Visa cards to volunteers that they managed to bring in. And so part of the problem we're up against is some of the money is still very badly hidden. And the second part of that is it's not entirely clear that that's illegal, because all the law around this is in flux.
Well, the law is in flux, and it's I don't know, it's we can be more specific than in flux. We can say it's disintegrating under the current Supreme Court. And let me tell you how it's disintegrating. The Supreme Court, when it comes to campaign finance rulings, and this goes back to the one in the 70s called Buckley versus Vallejo, where they essentially said, in shorthand, money is speech, and they said you can't limit anybody spending their own money. That sort of led to the gazillionaires reaching into their own pockets. They also said, well, if you're running a ballot initiative campaign, there's no candidate to corrupt, so go right ahead and spend as much as you want. And that's led to the ballot initiative campaigns we see in California that have helped, make our legislature less functional, because people think, well, if we can't get something passed with lobbying, we'll just go to the voters directly. Mm-hmm. And then there's been a series of subsequent decisions, of which Citizens United is the last one. And what the court does is they make these decisions in a theoretical vacuum. Now, Justice Kennedy, who was a swing vote on the current Supreme Court, said in Citizens United, what's the big deal if people give money to super PACs? There's going to be disclosure. It's going to be revealed. Well, it's not being revealed. He was naive. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people have said that. The other thing the Supreme Court has done, it goes back to public financing, and this is what I mean when I say the laws are disintegrating. With public financing of elections, and this is the case, this happened in an Arizona case, you go out there, you want to run for office, you're supposed to gather enough signatures on a petition, and small $5 contributions, $5 or more, but small contributions, and then you qualify to get matching funds. Well, the Supreme Court said in Arizona that the matching fund formula could not stand. And what they meant was, if your opponent goes out and spends a ton of money, you're supposed to get more money from the state. And they said, no, that just can't happen. And in Maine, where there's also public financing law, and most of the state legislature there uses it, they struck down the same thing because they have another right-wing governor. Mm. So this is what I mean when I say these laws are disintegrating. And, and they just are leaving narrower options for people to do something that doesn't take, just the big checks. I mean, because it is possible. I want to be positive here.
Please, at this point, please, yes.
It is possible to run for office and win without spending a ton of money. I mean, we have the Internet, we have social media, we have all the Twitter and things like that, just like the way the Occupy movement got organized and everything like that. Mm-hmm. That doesn't cost money. That takes human capital. That takes, emotional commitment. And, the idea behind public financing, which is where we started this discussion, is if you can build a grassroots base, it's not just an air war or, that's maybe slang, but it's not just, whoever can buy the most commercials. That tends to work in smaller jurisdictions. So the states that have passed this law and where it's been used and it's been essentially not, wrecked by federal court decisions have been states like Maine and Vermont, and and it's been like in some cities and some counties. So it's not as if we're without hope on this stuff, but it's an ever shrinking leg because that's the way the Supreme Court is.
Well, let's talk about some of the court challenges to public financing. Have there been court challenges on constitutional grounds? Is this the kind of thing that we see fought in the states and it stays in the state, or it's got potential to go all the way up to the Supreme Court as a federal issue?
What actually ends up happening is there is one particularly accomplished, and I say that with disdain and respect, Republican lawyer. His name is James Bopp. He's a good friend of Mitch McConnell, and he has a law firm based in Indiana that has been filing all these different constitutional challenges. They are not dummies at all. They look for constitutional challenges that they can make at any level of local, whether it's city laws. They just did one challenging a ban on corporate contributions in San Diego. They lost. They file challenges to because they don't want to have any regulation, and they also don't want any disclosure. And their whole argument is if you didn't have all these regulations and everything like that, you wouldn't have all these people hiding, and people would just spend the money, and everything would be just wonderful. And so what happens is the Buckley versus Vallejo decision in 76 said, it was 75 or 76, said you can't regulate anybody's spending. That's because that's like a free speech exercise. You can only regulate contributions because that could become an issue involve corruption. Mm-hmm. So when the state of Vermont passes its public financing law and it imposes spending limits, it's not like the state, the Republicans within Vermont essentially sued. I mean, they found people who said, well, okay, we'll support your suit. It wasn't, but it wasn't Vermonters in the first instance. It was essentially, this very ideological advocacy group, under the Republican Party, coming in and basically filing these suits, and then it goes into federal court. The appellate judges look at the Supreme Court ruling in Buckley and they say, Vermont, your spending limits are gone.
Mm. Well, let me ask you something that's been on my mind as we've been discussing this, and we've been discussing this both on and off the air. Right now, I'm listening on audiobook to the words, the thoughts, the actions of Ben Franklin and everything that happened around 1776. One of the things that consistently strikes me as I go between the audio of that in my car to whatever newscast comes on is that there just seems to be a different philosophy about what is important in the country. And talking to you and talking to Lee Fang earlier, and we're going to be talking later on in this hour to Darcy Burner, talking to her, it seems to me that the fights about campaign finance reform and about money in elections come down to that same breakdown in beliefs about what our country is about. The country is about a democracy where the people's voice is still represented and a fight for power that includes stifling the voice of the public because it's inconvenient. And I'm wondering if that's the way you look at this.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I'll give you the best example of this. The constitutional, drafters, the drafters of the Constitution were very skeptical of government overreach, but they were also skeptical of what today we would call corporate power. The only corporations that were founded, that existed around 1800, were essentially state-chartered entities to build roads and build canals and bridges and tolls. And there was a reason they were really skeptical and frowned upon, and that's because the economic sort of abuse of the colonies, by the British Crown and by their biggest trading companies that were doing and controlling business here, were the things that really were an affront to everybody. I mean, people had to pay a tax on every piece of property. There was all this crazy stuff like that. So the thing was, there was a genuine push to subvert or lower or hold those economic privileges below the rights of people and men. So as we fast forward, almost 2 centuries, what happened was the government started creating limited liability corporations before the Civil War, and all of a sudden people could go into business and know they were going to lose money and not be liable for it. And all of a sudden, corporations started getting all this other power, and they started being, talked about in state laws and federal laws as if they were individuals. They were synonymous. And it's grown and grown and grown and grown to the point where, these days when you look at different sectors of law, whether it's election law, whether it's public health, you can't put really graphic images on cigarette boxes because cigarette companies have more First Amendment speech rights to control their packaging than public health agencies like the FDA that are trying to protect the public. That's kind of like where it's come to. And it's totally upside down. And when you have a Supreme Court, which is, the power between the presidency and Congress and Supreme Court ebbs and flows. Well, right now Congress is really weak. And right now the Supreme Court is really strong. And they are completely pro-corporate.
Mm-hmm.
It's scary.
Yeah, it's at the base of a lot of our problems.
I've been covering it sounds like a digression, but from our discussion here, it's exactly not. I've been covering the Supreme Court's healthcare hearings in the last couple of days, and at the very end of their hearing, they signaled that, it might be a little too much to strike the requirement that everyone carry some health plan, but it might not be so bad to roll back the expansion of Medicaid, the government health care program that's run by the states for the poor. Well, that would be perfectly fitting with this philosophy. I know everyone's been focusing on the mandate, but if you think about it, that would be creating a health insurance monopoly while shrinking the public health sector, perfectly consistent with everything else that keeps giving corporations more power and control. It's just frightening.
Steve Rosenfeld, I'm going to go home and cry into my pillow after this, but I do appreciate your time nonetheless. Thank you so much for taking time with us.
Well, it's always a pleasure.
Steve Rosenfeld is senior reporter and editor at AlterNet.org. We're going to put links to his work on our website at InDeepRadio.com. By the way, take a moment to drop by our Facebook page. We'd love to see you there. In Deep with Angie Coiro. You're listening to In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro as we continue our look at the effect of money on the election process. Darcy Burner is running for Congress in the state of Washington's 1st District. It's a crowded ticket. It's a 6-way race. And one of the most prominent names carries the most prominent wallet. Money on top of money. Suzanne Delbany is co-founder of Drugstore.com. She's a former CEO, a corporate VP with Microsoft. In fact, her husband is president of Microsoft's Office division. So a lot of cash there. Darcy Burner has been a strong and consistent progressive. She's fighting in what you might look at as the consummate post-Citizens United scenario, kind of a determined David against, among others, a very well-funded Goliath. And Darcy, first, let me welcome you to the show. Thank you for making time.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Now, I want to establish that we're not setting up good person, bad person here. What we're setting up is the reality that we're seeing across the United States is deep pockets versus a traditional campaign where, of course, you have donations coming in. Of course, you have sponsors. But you're not independently rich. You're not in a position to, as we are seeing in some parts of the country, people who set out to buy an election. You're talking to the land of Meg Whitman here. So we both know how that effort goes. I think it's interesting to ask your perspective as someone who ran first before the Citizens United decision, because you've run for office before, and now you're having to run post-Citizens United. What's the difference like for you?
Well, there are a couple of things. When I ran before, there was a part of campaign finance law called the Millionaire's Amendment, which said that if one of your opponents put a certain amount of their own money into the race, that the contribution limits to your campaign would increase, which was meant to even it out a little bit in terms of the playing field. The Millionaire's Amendment was tossed out by the Supreme Court along with Citizens United, and as a consequence, I'm running against somebody who is worth many, many millions of dollars. Her husband was paid roughly $15 million last year alone by Microsoft. And she has already said that she's planning to put millions of dollars in. And it's interesting because her argument to Democratic voters isn't that she's the best candidate or that she's going to pursue policies that they care about, but is much more about, she's going to put in the money to buy the election, therefore they should support her, which is frustrating and not how our democracy should work.
Let me interrupt you there. She's open about that?
She is pretty open about that. When she's asked about it, she's made it clear that she's planning to put millions of dollars of her own money into the race. And that the fact that she's going to do that, and that will allow her to buy lots of television airtime, is what she's presenting as the reason people should support her.
Wow. That's an answer I was obviously not prepared for. Tell me a little bit about that district. What kind of people work there? What's their income like? Is that the kind of thing that goes over well there?
Well, I don't think it's going to go over nearly as well as she thinks it will. The district is, we've just gone through redistricting as all of the other states have as well, and so this is a newly drawn district. About half of the population is in Redmond, Kirkland, and Bothell, which are high-tech suburbs. Microsoft obviously is in Redmond, but there are other high-tech companies in the area as well. The other half of the population of the district is scattered through a bunch of small towns, Snohomish, Concrete, Mount Vernon, where you've got folks who work more traditional parts of the economy. Building roads or working at the Alcoa plant just north of Bellingham or teaching in schools. And their reaction to this idea is actually one of horror. They're offended that someone would think that they should be entitled to buy a seat because they are a Microsoft multimillionaire.
I imagine that's probably reflective of, and again, I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and you do see the inherent conflict between new millionaires and millionaires coming in versus some of the blue-collar areas where there's a philosophical tension to begin with, even when there's not an election going on. What about the effectiveness of her message with the people who do prioritize money, people who are millionaires? I mean, that for them nowadays might seem run-of-the-mill. Well, of course, if she can buy the election, she's the person we should throw our support behind.
Well, and we're largely seeing that. It's actually kind of funny. We have almost 4,000 small donors to my campaign, and the average contribution size is about $50. So we're reaching out to thousands and thousands of people to support the race and getting relatively few large contributions. She, on the other hand, virtually all of the contributions she's bringing in, as far as we can tell, are in the $1,000 and up range. She doesn't need very many of those to raise a lot of money, but it's because the other folks who are very, very wealthy around here think it's natural that somebody who has a lot of money should be entitled to buy a seat in Congress.
This is so funny. You know what, Darcy? I've been on the radio for 25 years now, and I'm trying to remember a time when I was more set back for words than this. We all know how bad it is. Let me ask you about how you're conquering that or how you're attacking that. How are you getting the message across that this is not as it should be, along with the message, here is what I, Darcy Burner, will do for you if you do put me in?
Well, one of the nice things is that voters are a lot smarter than I think a lot of people, including my primary opponent, give them credit for being. They understand that there's a real problem with Congress having been bought and sold. And in the primary polling right now, I'm way ahead of her. I'm getting, depending on which universe we're polling into, 3 to 4 votes for every vote she's getting. Voters get it, and they get that it's not constructive to allow any millionaire who feels like it to buy a seat in Congress. But we do have to find ways to communicate with them in an environment in which we're likely to be drowned out, especially toward the end of the campaign.
I'm thinking about the position, not so much of the individual voters, which you just addressed, but if we can address now the issue of groups, lobbying groups, unions, people that have a collective interest in who steps into office. And in their case, they may really have a conflict of interest. For example, if they decide to go on principle and go with a person who is putting out stances other than I have the most money, they, in today's environment, run the risk of alienating the person who is, in fact, in a position to get into that office. Let's say they say, we're going to endorse Darcy Burner. We're going to put our time, our money, our energy, and encourage our members to do so, all for Darcy Burner. And, someone else manages to buy the office. Now they're in Dutch with that person. That's a heck of a decision for them to have to make.
Well, yeah, and I think that groups are struggling with it. We've seen mixed responses here. So, for example, the iron workers are supporting me, for which I'm very grateful. Democracy for America is supporting me. There are, a number of other organizations that have said, we want the person who's going to go fight for the stuff that we care about, and we know that Darcy is going to fight to make sure that everybody who works hard can get a good American job. That, we educate our kids, and people who need to go see doctors can go see them. But there are groups that are thinking that the easier path is to simply, endorse the person they think will buy the election as the safest route. And I actually find it kind of ironic because a lot of these are the same organizations that bemoan their elected officials not adequately standing up to the pressure of the super wealthy, and yet they turn around and do exactly the thing they're bemoaning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it reflects kind of the damned if you do, damned if you don't atmosphere, if I'm reading that correctly.
Well, yeah, and this is, I think, one of the unfortunate consequences of Citizens United. Money makes such a difference just in terms of having the capacity to communicate with voters. And so they're terrified by the consequences of having someone who's a multimillionaire in the race. It'll probably also be an issue in the general election, frankly, because there's a very good chance Coiro and Crossroads will decide to play in a bunch of House districts, including this one. And so we are going to have to develop, not just in this campaign, but broadly speaking, we as Democrats are going to have to develop alternative campaign strategies in which our theory isn't that we're going to outspend them on television.
Mm-hmm. One of the strengths I think your campaign has, and as I say, I've been following your political career for some time. One of the things that I've admired about your work is you are pretty much a straight shooter. And it seems as though both cash-wise and otherwise, we're in an era where there's so much tap dancing going on that being a straight shooter can be as much of a liability as it can be a benefit. I know that today, and we record this program during the week for rebroadcast over the weekend, today it's hitting the news that in your Twitter past, you had said something that were less than flattering about Barack Obama, that you did not agree with essentially everything he did. In that, I think you're speaking for progressives across the country who to some extent have felt, ranging from a mild disappointment to a great deal of anger, depending on who you talk to, about certain issues. And I'm wondering how that's playing out for you with the campaign trail, with the reaction. Are you seeing that people can still value that you say what you feel, that you say what you stand for?
Well, I think certainly there are a fair number of people who have said, no, I've also sometimes disagreed with the choices that Barack Obama has made. And it's not an unreasonable thing for Darcy to, have called it like she saw it, which is what I did. But there are, two of my primary opponents actually have been pushing very hard to get the press to cover this scandal that I don't agree with 100% of the things that Barack Obama has ever done.
You want to know you.
Well, the tweets in question were a response to the debt ceiling negotiations in which Medicare and Social Security were put on the table, which I profoundly disagreed with. And pressure from the left changed the course of those negotiations, which was great. But the idea that that we should never say what we think or mean if it's not strictly aligned with whoever happens to be the highest ranking elected official in the party is absurd. We need more people who are willing to tell the truth. And for better or for worse, I'm willing to do that.
Well, just strictly my opinion, I think it's for the better. But when it comes down to getting your campaign funded, does that compromise how much money you might see coming from the more strict, traditional, mainstream Democratic groups? Can they say, hey, you're not in lockstep, you're not going to get any money here?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. For the most part, because this is a contested primary, the more mainstream Democratic groups are staying out of it anyway. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, it's not that big a deal. I think that there may be a perception among a few folks that they would rather have somebody who is easier to control and isn't going to call them on it when they're compromising core Democratic values. And in that sense, yeah, if they want somebody who's much more willing to compromise core Democratic values than I am, they should look at a different candidate than me. Because I'm going to fight for the stuff I am out there telling voters I'm going to fight for. And I am going to do that regardless of what our president says, regardless of what congressional leadership says. I'm going to do it because it's why I'm doing this to begin with.
Darcy Burner is running for Congress in Washington State's 1st District. Darcy, let's talk a little bit about what's happened with the congressional budget, the Paul Ryan budget that was passed today by the House. And there was, of course, a Progressive Caucus budget that got shunted into the late night hours as to whether it would even be heard or not. Can you tell me about, if you do get into Congress, what do you feel you can do to strengthen the influence of the Progressive Caucus so that it might even be heard above the roar?
Well, one of the problems that we have as progressives is that the rules have really been very rigged against us. The way I've been explaining it is the Republicans have set it up so that we're playing a game of heads they win, tails we lose. And it's not going to matter how many times we flip the coin, because as long as that's what the rules are, we're going to lose. They've rigged it so that we spend a tremendous amount of political capital just making sure that the Medicare reimbursement rates for doctors stay, even year over year. And while we're spending that political capital on maintaining the status quo, they're winning new things. They've set it up so that the dynamic with the Senate is incredibly destructive, where they can kill a program with 50 votes, but it takes 60 votes to actually fund one. They've set it up so that members are starved for real information and access to expertise. Some of those problems are big and difficult to solve, but a lot of them are actually simple changes to the House rules or simple changes to the way the members of Congress operate. When I was running ProgressiveCongress.org, a big piece of what I was trying to do was strengthen the Progressive Caucus. And we did take them from being, when I first started the job, when I would go talk to press about the Progressive Caucus, they would literally laugh at me because to them the idea that the Progressive Caucus would be relevant was absurd. They've stopped laughing. The Progressive Caucus is now very relevant to every major discussion that's happening. And I will do everything in my power to help empower them to increasingly exercise their numbers and their influence to move public policy in a direction that's better for the American people.
I wonder, Darcy Burner, if you have heard about the suggestion from, amazingly, both sides of the aisle in the Congress. This is a conversation we had with Lee Fang earlier this hour, and he talked about a lifetime lobbying ban for members of Congress, or at least a very long cooling off period similar to what they have in Canada. I was surprised talking to Lee that this did come from both sides, and he said on the Republican side it actually come from a Tea Party candidate because they don't necessarily walk in lockstep with the Republicans, and they are appalled at the role of money in elections. So I just wondered your reaction upon hearing that this is being proposed and if you think it has any hope.
I think it's a terrific idea, and I think that there are actually a fair number of necessary congressional reforms where we probably can get some bipartisan consensus, especially with the Tea Party Republicans, who I think have come into Congress to find themselves frustrated at the rules that consolidate power in the hands of a handful of people in the leadership, at the expense of rank-and-file members being able to do their jobs. They want to do their jobs, and while I may disagree with some of the policies they're trying to accomplish, I respect that they genuinely are trying to serve the people that they were elected by, and we can probably find a fair amount of common ground on things like a lifetime lobbying ban for members of Congress.
I'm going to finish with you with the same question I finished with Lee, and that is to say, do you think there's any possibility that in our lifetime we will see federally funded, publicly funded elections?
I think it's possible. It's not easy, but it's a fight worth having because the status quo is unsustainable, a status quo in which the research has shown only the priorities of the very wealthy have an impact on what actually happens in Washington, D.C. The American people are well aware that that's the case, and they're increasingly furious about it. And I think that they understand that real fundamental campaign finance reform is a critical piece of changing that.
Darcy Burner, I have so much admiration for your intellect and your drive and your just your honesty in what you are and what you stand for, and your refusal to take no for an answer. I really wish you the best in this election.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that a great deal.
And here on our website, indeepradio.com, we're going to put links to Darcy Burner's election site. You can look that up there. And you'll see links to all of the various guests that we've had over the course of this hour. We've got another hour of In Deep to come. We're looking at the right's effort to reach out to the communities they don't even seem to like, including Latinos and LGBTs. Our Facebook page is In Deep with Angie Coiro. We're tweeting at In Deep Radio. And I am Angie Coiro. Stick around for more of In Deep.
But I'd rather live my own damn way. We'll take our culture back someday, but it's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better, but I know it's gonna get better. Yes, I know it's gonna get better, 'cause it almost always does. I can't say much about the who and how, but I believe it just because. Day by day our bonds unweave, mammon gloats as gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before.
Thanks for tuning in this week to In Deep, which is a production of Live from the Left Coast. You can get more information on the show and our company at lftlc.com. Live from the Left Coast. While you're there, you can become a member and support our work. We have a separate website for the show that is indeep.org. If you have any questions or feedback, there's a contact button right there, indeep.org. We are developing a recurring series on mental health issues in our country, especially in this economy. And you're a big part of that. We'd like your topic suggestions, your stories, and your questions. Send them in via our website, the contact button at indeep.org. Join us again this time next week for 2 more hours of in-depth conversation. I'm Angie Coiro. Thanks, and we will see you then. You're listening to WPWC 1480 AM, Dumfries, Virginia. We Act Radio, home of Washington's progressive working community.